Hi everyone, this is the lab for cell structure and function, and it has three parts to it, three activities. I'm going to start with the third activity, and I'm going to show you the background for the third activity because I think that the third activity is an umbrella, and then you get into the details in your first and second activity. So this section is going to be on eukaryotes, prokaryotes, and viruses, and how those all measure up for the biological edict of form follows function. So we're going to look at the form of these cells and their function and how they develop that way. And when we talk about cells, we're talking about the eukaryotes and prokaryotes, and then viruses are not cells, so we'll talk about them last. In your week 6 lab, you did enzyme catalysis. And that was a way of, you had methods of breaking down cell walls. So you learned about cell walls that's a type of cell structure. And you learned about its function in protecting the DNA around the cell. And you also used enzymes to conserve energy. And that is a function of a molecule to keep balance of energy uses within the cell so that everyone gets what they need within the cell by lowering some of that activation energy with enzymes. So you've already looked at some cellular structures and you've already looked at some of their functions. We're going to go into a lot more of them. This week, we're going to study the structure and function of more of those cell walls and more of those cell membranes. And we're going to study energy conservation in the cell by diffusion. So let's get started. When we talk about these cells, we have to start at the very beginning. And you have probably been taught in your high school biology classes that there are domains of living things, and then there's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? Probably did that over and over and over again. We are going to start at the domain level, at the umbrella level, and then work into the details. The first domain that was ever formulated for life on Earth was the domain bacteria, and that slowly evolved into the domain Archaea, and then later on, that evolved into the domain Eukarya. So we're going to explain all of these, but you see there the difference in cell sizes from the very start of life on Earth at about 2 micrometers. And Archaea didn't get any bigger at 2 micrometers, but Eukarya is known for much bigger cells at about 100 micrometers. So obviously there were changes in the structure of those cells to accommodate all of that volume. You're going to study that today. Well, in your labs. Let me move this up for you so you can see a little bit more. Great. Now, the domain bacteria do not include viruses because viruses are not alive. And these are domains of living things. So we are going to talk about bacteria. And Archaea comes from the Greek word for ancient, like archaeology, Archaea. They evolved from bacteria. These domains were the very earliest forms of life on Earth. They're very diverse. Literally, we don't know of all the bacteria that are out there. They're constantly evolving, constantly mutating and changing. There are unfathomable amounts of bacteria just in your gut alone, multitudes of them. They are unicellular organisms. They have no nucleus. Their DNA is within their cytoplasm. Get to that in a second. And these are called the prokaryotes. And there's a way to remember that. I'm really into mnemonics. There's a way to remember that. You know that pro is a prefix for before, right? And so that's easy to remember. And karyote is from the Greek for kernel. So before there was a kernel, in other words, before there was a nucleus, that's literally what that means. Prokaryote is before there were a nucleus. And you know of scores of bacteria, even though you haven't studied microbiome yet, you know of them all. You've been hearing of them all. But you may not have heard of the Archaea Domain. And that Archaea Domain comes into line down at the Jersey Shore when we have cyanobacteria blooms, and that causes a type of prokaryote to move in that can live in very harsh circumstances. This one here, this beach here, is a beach in Spain that was overtaken by a type of prokaryote that reflects red and pink, and this type of prokaryote can live in extremely salty circumstances that are much too salty for normal cells that live in the ocean. And we'll look into that a bit with this lab as well, and those saline solutions and what they can do to cells and how these cells can exploit that high salt concentration. Those are called cyanobacteria. Cyano for color, and bacteria, of course. They are evolved from bacteria in the Archaea domain. Another part of the Archaea domain are nitrogen fixators. And you may know these as peanuts and lentils that are grown as the undercrop every few years or so on a field of corn or on a field of cotton that gets completely wiped out of their nutritional value in that soil by that very demanding crop. Corn is demanding, cotton is very demanding. And so for a few years, 1 or 2 years, the farmer will plant nitrogen fixating crops like peanuts or beans, and these will fix nitrogen in the soil to basically give it a charge and a natural fertilizer that the farmer can then harvest. It's a beautiful system of nitrogen fixation. The nitrogen fixation is done by these types of bacteria. Beautiful system. When it comes to the other domain of Eukarya, that domain is noted for, as we said, its large cells. And this domain tends to be quite diverse. And while there were untold amounts of bacteria just in your gut, in Eukarya, the life forms are much more diverse. You've got gorillas there next to mushrooms, next to daisies. So, and here we have protists, which are their own, I don't know, are they animals? Are they fungi? Are they plants? Nobody knows really how to classify protists because they operate in all sorts of domains. We'll get into that in a second. But the domain of Eukarya covers several kingdoms. Remember, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Kingdom is next down. So kingdoms that are in the Eukarya domain include kingdom Plantae, kingdom Fungi, kingdom Animalia, and the protists, which are not a kingdom because we really haven't figured the protists out all that much yet. And you want to do some research on protists, we could certainly use your help. This Eukarya, you'll remember this word because "eu" is Greek for true. And in fact, that's why they sound the same way. Eukarya, true kernels, meaning they have a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. And these kingdoms are all, well, no. Yeah, these kingdoms are all multicellular. Protists are not one of the kingdoms, and they are not multicellular. Protists are unicellular, which is another reason we can't figure out how to classify them. So, but they are in the domain Eukarya, at least for now. When we talk about all of these domains together, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, they have some things in common. Obviously, everything is evolved from bacteria. So some of the bacterial structures and functions are going to pass down to Archaea and Eukarya. Let's look into what they have that pass down. Things in common include ribosomes and RNA. You might wonder why I put that first. There's a reason. Second up is DNA, which you've studied in a lab already for DNA extraction. And third up, they have a plasma membrane. All of them have a plasma membrane. You looked into that last week with the lab, or 2 weeks ago with the lab. All of them have cytoskeletal properties, and cellular metabolism and cellular respiration are an important process for all of these cells. We'll go into the specifics of that in a few minutes. Let's start with the ribosomes and the RNA and then go to the DNA. I talk about ribosomes and RNA first because they were probably the way that genetic information was passed through bacterial lines. They were probably the precursor to DNA. And that work was done in passing those genetic instructions to synthesize proteins. That work was done on ribosomes. There are ribosomes in the most primitive bacteria. There are ribosomes in every cell of your body. So that ribosomal structure was probably the earliest form of hereditary information passed down to code proteins, and eventually that evolved into DNA. The ribosome is a single strand. The DNA is a double strand. So you can see things tend to go from simple to complex. That's what makes us think that the RNA was first. So every cell that we're talking about, prokaryote and eukaryote, has genetic material, and now every cell that we're talking about has RNA and DNA, and every cell that we're talking about has ribosomes as a site to express the DNA code into proteins. Some cells, only the eukaryotes, have a nucleus. So that is in the eukaryotes, the nucleus houses the genetic material and keeps it safe behind the nuclear membrane. So the difference here is an evolutionary difference. Let's look at how that came about a bit. When we're looking at this, we're looking at billions of years ago, and the start of our solar system and the Earth, which is not the Big Bang. The Big Bang was 14.5 billion years ago, and our solar system started about 4.5 billion years ago. Big difference. And it took another billion years before the simplest bacteria formed, we believe. And they lasted for a long time until there was probably a mutation that allowed some bacteria to produce oxygen as a remnant of their energy work, so that all cells need an energy source. In the early atmosphere, that energy source was probably methane or probably hydrogen, and that gradually evolved into carbon dioxide, and one of the wastes was probably oxygen that formed our atmosphere. In forming that oxygenation of the atmosphere, some mutations took place where there were prokaryotes that used oxygen for their energy source. And gradually, about 2 billion years ago, less than that, 1.75 billion years ago, the first single-cell eukaryotes with a nucleus appeared on the scene, followed quite closely by multicell eukaryotes and into animals. So this is a process of evolution over billions of years, from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells. The difference is, and keep this in mind, prokaryotes carry their DNA as a circular strand